Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout, where today we're going to be going over the history of endurance. This is our third special stat. We went over strength and perception, and endurance is more similar to strength than it is to perception, where strength has been consistently pretty good throughout the Fallout games. Perception has been extremely good to very bad to decent again. Endurance is more leveled out, although I would argue in the early games that endurance wasn't quite as strong as it would become in the later games. So endurance in the early games of Fallout 1, 2, and Tactics did a couple of things. It increased your overall HP. This would remain the same in all of the Fallout games. The more endurance you have, the more HP you have. Makes sense. That's generally what endurance does in most games. This would also increase your overall poison and radiation resist. In the early games, this could be a decent factor. It really depends. Poison was a problem in like the early game of Fallout 2, and it could be really annoying if you just keep getting poisoned, especially if you keep running into random encounters with poison, because you don't really have a whole lot of healing options there. So poison resist was actually really good. As for like tactics in Fallout 1, it wasn't that big of a deal. It didn't happen too often, and usually you didn't have to worry about it when it did happen. Radiation resist has always been kind of a thing where the more endurance you have, the less rads affect you. This has always been okay. Funny enough, radiation's not really been that big of a problem in any of the Fallout games, and having more endurance is not really a great way to combat the amount of rads that you have. In the early games, this also dictated your healing rate, where over time you would heal up, so the more endurance you had, the faster you would heal up naturally. So endurance could be pretty useful there. It did have one trait related to it in the old games too, with chem resist. It didn't really affect endurance all that much, more just the addiction rate overall, so that one isn't really worth talking about. It was also affected by gifted, which was just a +1 to it in exchange for less overall stats and lower points every time you leveled up, but it was still a fantastic trait. Endurance also had some pretty good perks related to it. One in particular that would really stand out for it that made it a whole lot better would be Life Giver in the early games. Because Life Giver in the early games wasn't quite the way that it worked in the later games, where in the later games it usually just gave you a flat amount of HP bonus, which was good. That was always nice. And this one was kind of the same, but this one would give you a flat rate of hit points every time that you leveled up. And in the old games, you could stack this, so you could get like 2 levels of Life Giver. I think you could only go to 2 in the old games, but that would make it so every time that you level up, you get another 8 HP added to your overall character. And the great thing about that is that in the old games, you could actually save up perk points. So you could wait until you could get Life Giver, and I think you only needed 4 endurance in these games to get that. And that would be worth about the same as like 8 levels to endurance. So it was a huge increase if you just wanted to wait there. It would make the early game significantly more difficult because you could go with low endurance. You'd have lower HP to begin with, but as the game went on, you would suddenly get a whole lot more HP. So endurance, you didn't really need to put very many points in to make a whole lot of use out of it. The rest of the perks for endurance were okay in the early games, nothing way crazy. Toughness was always a useful perk and would remain a useful perk in pretty much all the Fallout games. And strong back was there if you needed more carry weight, so that was a nice quality of life thing. As well as endurance also affected your unarmed skill, so you got more unarmed from that. Although it didn't affect unarmed damage in the early games, that was strength that helped with that one. His strength and endurance both went to unarmed and melee. And moving from the old games to Fallout 3, endurance wouldn't really see a whole lot of change. It would see some minor changes where it would still affect your HP, it would still affect your radiation and your poison. It now affected big guns, where it didn't do that before, and it affected your unarmed more. So now this was the governing stat instead of strength, which made it so the more endurance you had, the better unarmed you had. Big guns were kind of useful in Fallout 3. The main problem with pumping points into big guns, though, is that there was a well-known exploit in Fallout 3 where you could get 100 big guns without any trouble, just from magazines that would keep respawning. So you didn't really need to buff up endurance if you were going for that. This would also increase the total amount of oxygen you have when you dive now. So having higher endurance could make those sections where you wanted to dive around the map a little bit better. There wasn't a whole lot of spots for that in Fallout 3. There was a few, mostly around like Rivet City, some places around the Anchorage Memorial, and then pretty much around the buoys at Point Lookout, and that was about it. It did have some useful perks. It still had Life Giver, although Life Giver was significantly weaker in Fallout 3 than it would be in some of the earlier games, since this would just give you a flat amount of healing, but it was still good. And it still counted for things like Strong Back and Toughness, which were really good perks. You could also go with solar powered now. Solar powered was actually pretty solid in Fallout 3 if you wanted. It'd give you more strength and it would give you more healing over time. So endurance was nice to throw some points into, but you didn't need to put too many points into it if you didn't want to. Into New Vegas, endurance would change a little bit again. Big guns were no longer in the game, but now this would affect your survival skill, which was good. Having more survival was actually very useful in Fallout 3 because it made it so healing items like food and stuff would heal you more than they otherwise would, as well as it would help on the hardcore mode, and it made it so you had more recipes, as well as it was responsible for a lot of perks that were really useful. Still affected unarmed and HP, radiation and poison resist as well. Main upgrade that endurance got in Fallout New Vegas though, and why you wanted to have a really high amount of this, was that it affected the total amount of implants that you could have, which effectively were your bobbleheads in this game, going +1 to all of your special stats, as well as a couple other bonuses like the subdermal armor, giving you basically a stronger version of toughness when you had that on there. You could also stack it with toughness to make it really good, and you had like the monocyte breeder that would make it so you regenerated HP over time. All of those you could buy. This wouldn't affect the Old World Blues implants, you could just get those if you had the money for them, but it would affect the base game implants, so generally you wanted high endurance just because it would give you more special stats overall, which would be a bigger increase throughout the entirety of the game, because +1 to all your special stats is really nice. It didn't really get any new perks for it. It was still pretty much the same perks that were good in Fallout 3 for New Vegas. There were a couple more added, but nothing that was super noteworthy. And then into Fallout 4, endurance would slightly change once again, to where this one would be a little bit more useful in Fallout 4, I would say. This one would once again affect your total amount of HP, so the more endurance you have, the more HP you got, and it would also affect your action point depletion rate when you were sprinting, because now action points would be taken away when you were sprinting. This would also have some of the strongest perks in it, in my opinion, that would make some characters really overpowered in Fallout 4, especially towards the late game where you just keep scaling and keep scaling and keep getting more HP. So endurance had toughness once again, although this was probably the weakest version of toughness that we've seen, so it wasn't that great. It was okay in the early game, but armors were better. If this was percent bonuses rather than just a flat amount, that would make it better. Lead Belly was arguably at its strongest in Fallout 4, even though it wasn't all that strong. So, I mean, the first two levels of endurance aren't way crazy. Life Giver was probably at its strongest in Fallout 4, even though the old games had a very strong version of Life Giver. This one would give you more max HP, and then at the last rank of it, more max HP as well as slow HP regeneration constantly. That would be really, really strong because this was overall percentage health regeneration. So the later the game goes, the more this HP helps you. You had Chem Resistant, which was one of the best things in the game because it could just make you completely immune to chems. You had Aqua Boy and Aqua Girl, which the first rank was really nice just for not drowning. The other rank of this doesn't really matter. Just you don't get detected when submerged. That's fine. Rad Resistant, which was actually really good in Fallout 4 because radiation could be pretty annoying in 4 since it capped your total amount of HP. Just not capping your total amount of HP is good. You had Adamantium Skeleton, which made it so your limbs couldn't be broken. That was kind of okay, but Power Armor made that less useful if you were just going to be using a Power Armor build. Cannibal, which was fun and has always been a fun perk, but nothing way great. Then you had Ghoulish, which was again another arguably one of the best quality of life perks in Fallout 4. It was super nice to just get rid of your rads and have faster healing when you were irradiated. So that is really nice. And then you also had Solar Powered, which was probably at its strongest in Fallout 4 as well, which would still give you +2 strength, but now +2 endurance between the hours of when the sun were up. And you also now healed off your radiation damage and you regenerated your lost HP. If you stacked Ghoulish, Solar Powered, and Life Giver all together in any character in Fallout 4, as soon as you get to like level 50 or above, there's not a whole lot of things that can kill you unless they can kill you really quickly. Because a lot of the time you can just tank through most things and then just be healing up in between the fights that you're having to where you're probably going to be at full HP the whole time, and then you can use healing items for essentially money. Endurance has always consistently been good throughout the Fallout games. It's always been nice to have more HP. And that's kind of how it is in most games. Not only in Fallout, but we've seen it in other games like Diablo 2. You'd basically just want to get to the minimum requirements of your character and then just pump everything else into HP regardless of what character you were playing, because you just survive more that way. Same thing goes with pretty much any of the FromSoft games, where the hidden difficulty scaler is just the amount of HP you have. The more HP you have, the more times you can get hit and not worry about it so often. And this has been the history of endurance throughout the Fallout games. Always been consistent, always been pretty good. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at Charisma, which has had a lot of fluctuations like Perception. That should be a lot of fun too. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everybody!